I trusted him with my schedule. That's how he got my wife. I didn't realize a timetable could be a weapon until I saw my own life being used against me. Every late meeting, every early flight, every "I'll be home after 9" text. Those weren't just parts of my job. They were openings, windows, permissions I didn't know I was granting. Victor had been my driver for 3 years. Professional, quiet, precise, the kind of guy who remembered preferred routes, kept the car spotless, and never spoke unless spoken to. He didn't blend into our lives like a friend. He blended in like infrastructure, reliable, necessary, invisible. He knew my calendar better than I did sometimes, because it was his job to. He knew when I'd be gone, when I'd be stuck in traffic, when a meeting would run long. He knew the rhythm of my absence, the predictable gaps in my presence. And my wife lived in those gaps. The night it started for me wasn't the night it started for them. That's another truth people don't like to hear. I didn't walk in on a beginning. I walked in on something that had already settled into comfort. I came home 15 minutes early. That's it, 15 minutes. A small shift in routine that should have meant nothing. A meeting ended sooner than expected, and for once I didn't stay behind pretending I was still working just to look dedicated. I drove myself home, which I almost never did anymore. I wanted the quiet. I wanted to walk into my own house without coordinating anyone else's movements. When I turned onto our street, the first thing I saw was the black sedan, parked at the curb. Engine off, lights out, Victor's car. He was supposed to be gone by then. If he'd driven my wife somewhere, he should have been waiting with the engine running, or already on his way back to the garage. If he'd dropped her off, he should have disappeared the way he always did. Efficiently, cleanly, no trace. But the car was still there, like it had been told to stay. I slowed, told myself there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe she forgot something. Maybe he was waiting for another run. Maybe the schedule changed, and no one told me because no one needed to. The house was lit warmly when I stepped inside. Not bright, not harsh. Cozy. The kind of lighting you choose when you're trying to make a moment feel private. I called her name. No answer. I heard voices upstairs. Not loud, not urgent. Soft and unhurried, like they weren't afraid of being interrupted. That detail hit me harder than any sound could have. People who were doing something wrong usually move differently. Quicker, sharper, ready to scramble. These voices didn't scramble. They dipped slightly, as if someone adjusted volume out of habit. I stood at the bottom of the stairs with my hand on the banister, listening. My wife laughed. Quiet, relaxed, intimate. Not the polite laugh she used with acquaintances. Not the tired laugh she gave me lately when I tried to lighten the mood. This laugh belonged to a version of her I hadn't seen in months. I took a step up, then another. I told myself I wasn't going to catch her doing anything. I told myself I was going to walk up, ask what was going on, and feel embarrassed for being suspicious. I wanted that. I wanted to be wrong more than I wanted to be right. The bedroom door wasn't fully closed. I stopped. I could see just enough through the gap. They weren't in bed. They weren't tangled up in anything obvious. That's what makes it worse, in a way. Because it means the betrayal didn't need urgency. It didn't need desperation. It had room. My wife was sitting on the edge of the bed, barefoot, like she'd been there a while. Victor stood in front of her without his jacket, sleeves slightly rolled, posture softened. He was speaking quietly. She was looking up at him with attention. Real attention. The kind that says, I'm here with you, not just physically, but emotionally. Then she reached out and touched his wrist, not like a person checking a watch, like a person claiming familiarity. Victor didn't move away. He leaned in. I stepped back before my brain could register more. My breath felt loud, like it might betray my location. I moved down the stairs slowly, deliberately, as if going too fast would make this more real. I sat at the kitchen table. I waited. A minute later, Victor came down alone. He stopped when he saw me. For the first time in 3 years, his professional mask slipped. His eyes widened just enough to show he hadn't expected me. "Sir," he said, voice careful. I nodded once. "You can go." He hesitated. "Your wife." "You can go," I repeated. He picked up his keys from the counter like they belonged there. That small detail made my stomach twist. He'd been comfortable enough to set his things down in my kitchen. He left. The car pulled away smoothly, as if the night hadn't just shifted the axis of my life. My wife came down a moment later. She didn't look surprised. That was the detail that broke me. Surprise would have meant panic. Panic would have meant this was new. Surprise would have meant she still had a conscience sharp enough to flinch. Instead, she looked like someone who'd been caught mid-routine. "I didn't hear you come in," she said softly. "I know," I replied. She sat across from me and folded her hands, composed herself the way people do when they think they can still shape what happens next. "It's not what you think," she said. I held her gaze. "Then tell me what I think." Her eyes flicked toward the window, then back to me. She took a breath like she was choosing a version of the truth that might keep me in the room. "It just happened," she said. "I didn't plan it." I let the silence stretch. "How long?" I asked. Her mouth tightened. "A while." A while. That meant weeks at minimum. Months, more likely. That meant routine. That meant the schedule, the one I trusted Victor with, had been feeding this. I stood up slowly, not shaking, not yelling, just aware of something irreversible settling into place. "You didn't just cheat," I said quietly. "You used the access I paid for. You used the trust I gave. You let him learn my absences like a map." Tears rose in her eyes, but they didn't change her face. She started talking. Loneliness, pressure, how close proximity blurs lines, how Victor was always there, how I was always gone. I listened until she ran out of words. Then I said the one thing that made her go still. "Tonight wasn't the first time," I said. "And you both know it." She didn't deny it. And in that moment, the story stopped being about whether she cheated. It became about what it cost to stay in a life where my own schedule had been turned into a tool to erase me. Because if trust could be used that neatly, if my calendar could be weaponized that easily, then whatever came next wouldn't be solved with a fight. It would be solved with a decision. The next morning, my wife acted like the night before had been a storm that passed. She moved quietly through the kitchen, made coffee, asked if I wanted eggs, the same way she did on normal Saturdays. Her voice had that careful softness people use when they're trying not to startle something wounded. I watched her hands. Steady, unshaking, no panic, no shock. That told me she'd already rehearsed life after being caught. "Did you sleep?" she asked. "A little," I lied. I hadn't slept at all. I'd stared at the ceiling in the guest room, replaying the moment at the bedroom door like my brain was trying to find a version that hurt less. Every replay ended the same way. Her hand on his wrist, his body leaning in, their comfort. Comfort is the part that breaks you. Not the betrayal itself, but how natural it looks on them. I didn't confront her again that morning. I didn't ask for details. I didn't demand she call Victor and end it in front of me. Those things would have felt satisfying for about 10 seconds, and then they would have turned into a performance. Tears, promises, the kind of closure that isn't closure at all, just delay. Instead, I said, "I'm going out for a bit." She lifted her head quickly. "Where?" "Errands," I replied. Her eyes tracked me for a beat too long, as if she was trying to calculate the risk. Then she nodded. "Okay." That single nod confirmed something I hadn't wanted to admit. She was still managing timing. I drove aimlessly at first. My hands were calm on the wheel, but my chest felt tight, like the air inside me had changed density. I thought about Victor, how often I'd handed him keys, how often I'd stepped into that car and felt safe, how many private conversations my wife had likely had in the back seat while he drove. A driver hears everything. A driver sees everything. A driver becomes part of the routine without being part of the relationship. until he is. I pulled into a parking lot and sat there with the engine off, staring at my phone. I wanted to call Victor, tell him to meet me, demand a confession, fire him on the spot. But another thought cut through that impulse. If I acted fast, I'd act blind. And this wasn't just about betrayal, it was about access, about how deeply they'd used my schedule, my calendar, to build something behind my back. I needed to know what I was dealing with before I swung. So, I did something that felt colder than anything I'd ever done in my marriage. I started observing. That week, I went back to work as usual. Meetings, calls, deadlines. I played my role. I even let Victor drive me a few times as if nothing had changed. He kept his eyes on the road, his posture professional, but I noticed tiny shifts. Less conversation, even less than before. A tension in his shoulders, the way he avoided the mirror when I looked up. He knew I'd seen something. He just didn't know how much. My wife adjusted too. She became more attentive at home, asked about my day, touched my arm when she passed, cooked meals she knew I liked. It would have felt sweet if it hadn't been so obviously strategic. She wasn't reconnecting. She was patching. The first real escalation came from my calendar. Victor texted me one afternoon. Your wife asked if I can pick her up at 5:30. Is that okay? That message was routine, normal, but my wife hadn't told me she needed a ride. I replied, sure. Then I watched what happened. At 5:20, she called me. Hey, I'm running late. I might be out a bit. Out where? She didn't say. She didn't need to. The vagueness itself was a pattern now, an attempt to keep the story flexible. Okay, I said. Be safe. When Victor arrived to pick her up, I was already parked down the street from our house. I watched her step into the back seat. She didn't glance around, didn't hesitate. She moved like someone entering a space she'd already claimed. The car pulled away. I followed at a distance. They didn't go to an appointment. They didn't go to a friend's house. They didn't go anywhere that required a driver. They went to a quiet parking lot behind a small shopping strip, the kind of place you'd never notice unless you were looking for it. Victor parked. The engine stayed running. The windows were slightly tinted, but I could see enough to confirm what my gut already knew. They weren't talking like employer and employee. They were leaning toward each other like people who had done this before. I didn't need to see a kiss to understand intimacy. Intimacy is in the way bodies move when they believe they're safe, in the way time stretches without urgency. After 10 minutes, the car pulled back onto the road. Victor dropped her off at a boutique cafe, waited while she went inside, then drove away. He'd given her a cover story, a place to be seen. I sat there, hands tight on the steering wheel, feeling the last pieces click into place. This wasn't a spontaneous affair fueled by emotion. This was operational. They were using the driver role as camouflage. My wife could disappear for hours and no one questioned it. Because she was with Victor. Victor could be with her and no one questioned it. Because it was his job. That's how they got comfortable. That's how they got away with it. That night, my wife came home with a small bag of pastries from the cafe, like she'd been out on an innocent errand. She kissed my cheek and placed the bag on the counter. Thought you'd like these, she said. I looked at the bag and felt something cold rise behind my eyes. She wasn't just lying. She was decorating the lie. Later, when she fell asleep, I stood in the hallway and stared at our bedroom door. I thought about how easily she'd sat at my kitchen table that first night and tried to control the narrative. How Victor had kept his keys on my counter like he belonged there. I thought about my calendar, my schedule, the thing I'd trusted them both with. And I made another decision. I wasn't going to confront them until I had leverage. Not revenge leverage. Reality leverage. The kind that keeps people from rewriting the story once they feel threatened. Because I knew what would happen when I finally said the words out loud. My wife would cry and claim confusion. Victor would claim temptation. And both of them would imply it was my fault for being gone. I needed to be ready for that. So the next day, I opened a private folder on my laptop and began documenting everything. Times, locations, messages, patterns, Not because I wanted to destroy them, but because I refused to be gaslit into doubting what I'd seen. And as I typed, one truth kept repeating in my mind, steady and merciless. If my schedule gave them the opening, then my schedule could also end it. I just had to pick the right moment. There's a strange calm that comes once you stop wondering if something is happening and start focusing on how it's happening. That calm settled in over the next few days. I stopped reacting emotionally and started thinking structurally. Patterns, dependencies, who relied on who thought they were untouchable. Victor was careful, but not careful enough. When you work for someone long enough, you forget where the boundaries actually are. You start believing routine is protection. That professionalism is a shield. It isn't. The first real discovery didn't come from watching them. It came from noticing who else depended on Victor, the car service company. Victor wasn't freelance. He worked through a small firm, one I paid generously to ensure discretion and reliability. I'd always dealt with the owner, a man named Daniel, who prided himself on running a clean operation. No drama, no blurred lines. Drivers were vetted carefully because, as Daniel once said, our job is access. That word stuck with me. Access. I called Daniel and asked him to meet for coffee. I didn't explain why, just said I wanted to review service details. He showed up on time, relaxed, confident, unaware he was about to become an ally without realizing it. We talked numbers first, routes, hours, flexibility. Then I asked casually, "How do you monitor driver conduct?" Daniel smiled. "We're strict: GPS logs, timestamps, passenger confirmations." "Why?" I took a breath. "Hypothetically," I said, "if a driver were misusing company time for personal reasons, you'd know." His smile faded slightly. "Yes." "Even if the passenger was familiar?" He leaned back, studying me now. "We've terminated drivers for less." I nodded. "I'd like copies of Victor's recent logs." The silence that followed was heavy but respectful. "Is there a problem?" Daniel asked carefully. "There might be," I said. "I need facts before I decide." Daniel agreed. He didn't argue, didn't ask invasive questions. He understood discretion cuts both ways. 2 days later, the files arrived. GPS logs, timestamps, idle durations, routes that didn't align with reported errands. Gaps where the car sat stationary in places that weren't destinations. Parking lots, side streets, quiet stretches behind businesses. The same spots. Repeatedly. I overlaid the logs with my calendar and my wife's vague out times. It matched perfectly. The realization didn't hurt. It clarified. This wasn't an emotional spiral. It was a system. A routine built around my absence and Victor's role. They'd turned structure into cover, and structure leaves records. The second discovery came from my wife, without her knowing she'd given it to me. One night, she mentioned casually that Victor had suggested a new route to avoid traffic near downtown. Said he'd figured out shortcuts. Shortcuts? I smiled and nodded, but inside I noted the phrasing. Drivers don't suggest shortcuts unless they've tested them, unless they've had reasons to linger in certain areas. I checked the logs again. The so-called shortcuts were the same places they'd been stopping. He wasn't just driving her, he was shaping her movement. That's when the anger finally surfaced. Not explosive, but sharp. Because this wasn't a lapse in judgment. This was collaboration. Two people aligning their roles to create privacy inside my own life. The third discovery was quieter. I noticed my wife no longer asked Victor to drive me when we were both going somewhere. She preferred to take me herself or suggest separate departures. At first I'd assumed it was convenience. Now I understood. She was protecting their space. I confronted Victor indirectly first. I asked him to drive me to a meeting that didn't exist. He didn't question it. He never did. But halfway there, I told him to pull over. He did. I looked at him in the rearview mirror. "How long have you been driving my wife without reporting stops?" I asked calmly. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. "I don't know what you mean, sir." I nodded. You've been logging time, locations. You know exactly what I mean. He swallowed. I can explain. I don't need an explanation, I said. I need honesty. Silence stretched between us. Finally, he said, It wasn't supposed to go this far. That sentence told me everything. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten him. I didn't even fire him then. I just said, Finish the drive. When we arrived, I stepped out of the car and paused. You don't work for me anymore, I said, but you're still responsible for your choices. He nodded, eyes downcast. I reported him to Daniel that afternoon. Termination was immediate. That left one final conversation. My wife. I waited until the house was quiet. No distractions, no exits planned. I laid out the logs on the table. The times, the places, the pattern. She didn't deny it. She didn't cry right away. She just stared at the papers like they'd rearranged reality in a way she could no longer negotiate. You planned this, I said. You didn't drift into it. She whispered, I didn't think you'd ever look this closely. That was the moment the last illusion died, because love doesn't survive in the shadow of secrecy that calculated. I told her I knew about the stops, the cover locations, the way they use my schedule like a map. She finally cried then, not because she was caught, because she was exposed. And standing there, looking at a woman I no longer recognized, I understood the real discovery of this chapter. I didn't need to ask why she did it. I needed to decide what kind of man I was going to be now that I knew how. Because this wasn't a marriage crisis anymore. It was a reckoning. And the next step wouldn't be quiet. It would be final. Once everything was laid out on the table, the house felt different. Not tense, not explosive, exposed. My wife sat across from me, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes swollen but focused, like someone realizing the room they thought was private had mirrors on every wall. The papers between us, GPS logs, timestamps, route histories, weren't just evidence. They were proof that this wasn't confusion or weakness. It was design. You tracked us, she said quietly. I verified, I replied. There's a difference. She flinched, not at my tone, but at the calm in it. Calm scares people when they expect anger. Anger gives them something to push against. Calm takes the floor out from under them. I didn't think you'd go this far, she whispered. I didn't think you would either, I said. But here we are. She tried then. Not denial, she was past that, but reframing. Loneliness, proximity. How Victor was always there when I wasn't. How one conversation blurred into another. How lines softened over time. I let her speak, because people reveal more when they think you're still deciding. You didn't come to me, I said when she paused. You came home to me, but you didn't come to me. She shook her head, tears falling freely now. I didn't know how. You knew how to coordinate stops, to manage schedules, to lie convincingly. I leaned forward slightly. You knew how to protect what you wanted. That landed. She wiped her face with the heel of her hand, breathing unevenly. What do you want me to say? I stood up. That was the moment the conversation shifted from discussion to conclusion. I want you to understand something, I said. This didn't happen because I was busy. It happened because you chose a version of your life where I was optional. She looked up at me, eyes wide. That's not true. It is, I replied, because when people still choose you, they wait. They don't build systems around your absence. Silence filled the room. Then she asked the question she'd been holding back. Are you leaving? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I walked to the window and looked out at the street. The same street where Victor's car had sat quietly, like it belonged there, like it had always been part of the plan. I already left, I said finally. I just haven't packed yet. Her breath hitched. Please, don't do this tonight. Tonight is exactly when this happens, I replied, because tomorrow you'll start editing the story, and I won't be part of that. She stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. I'll cut contact, I swear. I'll do whatever you want. I turned back to her. That's the problem, I said. You already did what you wanted. The words hit harder than shouting ever could. I went upstairs and packed a bag, slowly, deliberately. Clothes, documents, nothing sentimental. Sentiment had already been compromised. When I came back down, she was standing by the door, eyes red, hands clenched. Where will you go? She asked. That's not something I need to explain anymore. She stepped closer. We built a life. Yes, I said, and you built another one inside it. She reached for my arm. I stepped back. Not dramatically, just enough. This isn't punishment, I said. It's consequence. I opened the door. The cool night air felt sharper than I expected, like the world reminding me I was still awake, still present, still capable of leaving a place that no longer respected me. She followed me onto the porch. You're really doing this? Yes. For him? She asked suddenly, bitterness slipping through the grief. Because of him? I stopped and turned to face her one last time. No, I said, because of me. That was when she understood. Not fully, but enough. I walked down the steps and didn't look back. The drive away was quiet. No music, no racing thoughts, just the steady hum of motion and the strange realization that the hardest part had already happened. The confrontation wasn't the climax. The decision was. Because the moment I chose not to argue anymore, not to negotiate my worth, not to compete with someone who had access instead of integrity, that's when the story turned irreversible. And whatever came next, it would not include living inside a schedule someone else used to erase me. Leaving didn't feel like escape, it felt like suspension. The first few nights after I walked out, I stayed in a quiet apartment a colleague owned but rarely used. Minimal furniture, blank walls, no reminders. I slept on a mattress on the floor and woke up before dawn every morning. My body still running on adrenaline, my mind replaying conversations that were already finished. There was no regret, just residue. People assume that once you make a clean decision, peace follows immediately. It doesn't. What follows is silence. And silence forces you to hear yourself without distraction. My wife tried to reach me for days. At first, the messages were emotional. Apologies layered with explanations. Loneliness. Fear. How close proximity had blurred lines. How she hadn't meant for it to become anything serious. I didn't respond. Then the messages became practical. Therapy. Boundaries. Promises. She said she'd never speak to Victor again, as if that was the price of entry back into a life she'd already compromised. I still didn't respond. Finally, the messages stopped. That was when I knew she'd moved from panic to reality. I went back to work quietly, didn't announce anything, didn't share details. I kept my schedule deliberately unpredictable, not out of paranoia, but reclamation. For the first time in years, my calendar belonged to me alone. The car service replaced Victor without comment. Daniel apologized once, sincerely, and never brought it up again. Access, once abused, closes quickly when consequences appear. That mattered. The divorce unfolded without spectacle, paperwork, meetings, calm voices discussing the division of things that once symbolized permanence. There were no fights over objects. Objects weren't the loss. The loss had already occurred in small moments. Each time my wife chose convenience over honesty, each time she coordinated secrecy instead of conversation. Signing the final papers didn't feel like an ending. It felt like acknowledgement. Months passed. The apartment filled in slowly. A couch, a desk, books I'd meant to read but never had time for. I cooked again, not to impress anyone, but because feeding myself felt grounding. I learned what quiet evenings actually sounded like without the low hum of unresolved tension underneath. One afternoon, I realized something unexpected. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger needs an audience. It needs someone to perform for. Once I stopped explaining myself, once I stopped defending my decision, the anger lost its purpose. What replaced it was clarity. I saw my marriage for what it had become, not what it had been at its best, not what I wished it still was, but what it had turned into, a system where my absence was no longer a problem to solve, but an opportunity to exploit. That understanding freed me. I ran into my wife once after that, a parking lot, late afternoon. Neither of us had planned it. She looked different, not diminished, just stripped of certainty. We exchanged polite greetings. No tension, no heat. "I didn't think you'd really leave," she said quietly. "I didn't think you'd really do what you did," I replied. There was no cruelty in it, just symmetry. She nodded, absorbing that. "I hope you're okay." "I am," I said, and for the first time, I knew it was true. Driving away, I felt no urge to look back, because closure isn't something someone else gives you. It's something you claim when you stop negotiating your worth. The betrayal didn't ruin me. It clarified me. It showed me how easily trust can be repurposed when people stop seeing you as essential, how access can masquerade as loyalty, how silence can feel safer than honesty to someone afraid of consequences. And it taught me this: if someone can use your absence as permission, then your presence was never truly valued. Now, my life is quieter, smaller in some ways, but it's honest. Every decision is mine, every boundary intact, every relationship entered with eyes open instead of assumptions. I don't carry bitterness toward my wife. Bitterness would mean she still has influence. What I carry instead is awareness, and the discipline to walk away the moment respect becomes optional. I trusted him with my schedule. That's how he got my wife. But trusting myself to leave when I saw the truth, that's how I got my life back.